Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, intergenerationally, an entire group of people, their collective identity and culture have been shat upon by their inability to feel safe, their inability to have a home, their inability to live their day-to-day lives, and as a consequence have been pushed to the fringes all around the world, and even waging war in their name at their expense to be able to help these individuals. We think that this is a value judgment debate about the interest of the international community and by extension the world to be able to recognize Palestine as a state, but more importantly as a consequence, recognizing them as a people, as a culture, and as an identity. We think that for far too long, these forever wars have gone for far too long, and the root of this, ladies and gentlemen, is the subjective ambiguity. Ambiguity about the legitimacy of the Palestinian state and the borders to which they operate for decades have been waging war at their expense where these people have been caught in the middle. We think that this particular debate, although a value judgment, has a few features in order to have the best possible debate. A, who is the international community? Basically, a reconciliation from west to east, the US to China, who we believe have the interest to recognize Palestine as a state. Yes, they might have different motives, different countries might actually be against Palestine, but we think that to a large extent, all of these countries are severely affected by the economic implications of such. From supply chain crises in the Red Sea, to port congestion that make the shipping and logistics of goods and services all around the world more expensive, to the rampant inflation we see in the United States and even in the developing world that have plagued us all, ladies and gentlemen. These are largely rooted on this conflict, and we think that once we do recognize them as a state, we're then going to be able to have a ceasefire and stop that conflict. Things aren't going to be perfect. It's going to be a shit show for sure. But we do know that this will gravitate towards peace and towards stability, which we have needed since the pandemic. Now you might be wondering, Joseph, what's the Palestinian state? And we think that a state essentially has 5 elements: territory or land, international recognition, government, population, and sovereignty. We think that vague things like sovereignty and international recognition come later and actually come when we recognize them as a state. We think that they already have people to comprise that. The two interesting ones are territory and government, right? For sure. Because opposition side's gonna be like, where do you draw the border? We can't agree on these particular things. In fact, we're waging war precisely about that, right? Similar to what we see between the China and the Philippines with the disputed islands. But we think that to an extent of how we draw the borders, it's outside this debate. It could be between the river and the sea. We think that it'll probably be Gaza and some legitimate extension of that, because we think that these people need a place to be able to call their home to feel safe. Now in terms of government, very simple. We are going to prop up leaders from the existing coalition parties and opposition groups that are going to exist. Now let me address the elephant in the room, Hamas, right? Because I'm sure their side is going to talk about how this is going to legitimize and prop up Hamas as a puppet government to further rape and intergenerationally mess up that state. But we have to understand how in status quo, what gives these terrorists power is the subjective ambiguity and soft power that they have over these informal groups of people. As a consequence, people cannot necessarily tell them, you are wrong, you are violating the Constitution and sovereignty, because nothing exists, ladies and gentlemen. The point in which we're able to establish a state is a point in which we can actually hold them truly accountable and therefore serve as a check and balance. There are 3 things we're going to prove from side opening government. The first is how we think that Hamas will continue to be Hamas, and we think that this is still going to be in the interest of the international community to do so, to be able to recognize them as a state. Secondly, we don't give a shit if Israel is offended, because we think largely that's also an elephant in the room, and we think that Palestine and the international community have more to gain as opposed to Israel having something to lose. And thirdly, we are going to deal with Hamas in the longer run when we're able to establish a state in order to be able to hold them truly accountable in domestic courts and also international courts. Any POIs to clarify everything I've said so far for the best debate? Going once? Going twice? First structural reason why we think that these things are going to likely happen. These malevolent actors, whether these be Hamas or whether these be Arab-phobic, Zionist, Israel individuals, really operate on their own volition. Meaning, any harm that side opposition will tell us will largely be symmetric, because on either side, assholes will be assholes, bigots will be bigots, and they're going to go rage either way. But we think that the international community specifically has the most to be able to gain from this particular endeavor at the point in which they're able to recognize the state. Why is that so particularly contentious? Because it's only when we recognize them as a state that these people can actually transition into actually having legitimate international relations within the East and the West. Start building bridges, ladies and gentlemen, and humanitarian corridors with China, with the US, with other developing nations, in order to do things like alleviate the refugee crisis we're already seeing. Alleviate things like xenophobia and mass racism, which come at the consequence of them having to knock and genuflect at the borders of other people in order to be able to have a chance to find a home, in order to be able to have food and water. We think that these very people on the ground, whether they be Palestinians from Israel, Palestinians from other countries, deserve a home and have a fundamental right and stake and claim to be able to having a state. The same way all of us all have a home and family to go to, imagine your inability to do that. Your inability to go home because a home no longer exists. The inability to have a family because they have long been affected by this intergenerational conflict. These, ladies and gentlemen, are what motivate our side of the house, and the only way to do it is through establishing them as a state, and we think the international community has the motive, resources, and capacity to do so. For all these reasons, we are very proud to